The second ancestor that we're looking at here on week 1 of transmission of the light is Kasyapa or Mahakasyapa. So I'm going to begin with the Cleary translation here. I'm going to look at page 4. So this is the second transmission. Or you could say the first transmission, depending on which way we're talking about it. Kasyapa, when the Buddha raised a flower and blinked his eyes, Kasyapa broke out in a smile. And the Buddha said, I have the treasury of the eye of truth, the ineffable mind of nirvana, and these I entrust to Kasyapa. So what is it to hold up a flower? Usually the flower represents the fleeting nature of the world, arising, persisting, and passing. And yet, here in this instance, it represents something more. And Kasyapa's smile, Kasyapa's recognition of this holding up as a demonstration, as a manifestation, in a very simple form. And what about this blinking of the eyes? We heard about it in the last chapter, in the chapter on Shakyamuni, and Keizan appears to have quite a lot to say about that. So let's go on with the chapter, and then I'll say a bit more about the koan. Except to point out that the Buddha clearly states that is the mind of nirvana that he is entrusting to Kasyapa. It's one of the few times in this text where there's such a clear statement about what is being transmitted. But as there is no giving and no receiving, Kasyapa has demonstrated that he recognizes the mind of nirvana. And that's why this entrustment is happening. Because of that smile of recognition. So it gives a little bit of the story of Kasyapa. I just want to point out that this third paragraph on page 4, Kasyapa met the Buddha, and the Buddha said, "Welcome, mendicant." That was the standard form of ordination at the Buddha's time. He simply said, "Ehi bhikkhu," come monk, and that was your ordination. So if you didn't already have your head shaved and your robe and bowl, then at that point you received it. But oftentimes they had even had that already, and were simply called by the Buddha, come, come, be a part of this. Come give your life to this way of being awakening, embodying awakening. So again, we have some examples of this very, very disciplined, intent, persevering, energetic pursuit of the path, which it talks about Kasyapa's emaciated body, his wretched clothing, Mm. So we know that he was someone who was very diligent in his practice. And then at the bottom of that page, we begin to see Kazon unpacking this story about the flower, the so-called raising of the flower at that time has been transmitted purely through a succession of masters. So this again is pointing at the idea that awakening is not something that is given or that is taken or received. One particular moment, one particular time, one particular place, one particular interaction is said to be a manifestation of awakening. But really, it is a realization of that which has always been true, which has always been present, which is actually always beyond true and false, but complete. Even any adjective we put on it is a limitation. Investigate carefully, Cleary translates on page 5. See thoroughly, know that Kasyapa is Kasyapa, and understand Shakyamuni Buddha as Shakyamuni Buddha, and simply transmit the way of complete enlightenment in depth. So each one of us, a complete statement of enlightenment. The Buddha, a complete statement of enlightenment. Kasyapa as a complete statement of enlightenment. You as a complete statement of enlightenment, if you will only realize it. And the Cook translation of this phrase slightly different. Understand that Kasyapa is Kasyapa and clarify that Shakyamuni is Shakyamuni, and separately transmit the perfectly pure way. So Cook's translation, again, because he tends to be a little bit more literalist, is pointing at exactly this, how each individual separately is a transmission of the full way, the perfect way. Then let's continue with the Cook here. Put aside for a while the holding up of the flower, okay, and clarify the blinking. There is not a hair's breadth of difference between your ordinary lifting your eyebrows and blinking and Gautama's holding up of the flower. There's not a hair's breadth difference between your speaking and smiling and Kasyapa's speaking and smiling. But if you don't know who it was that raised their eyebrows and blinked, so if you don't know awakening itself, then Shakyamuni and Mahakasyapa are in India, and skin, flesh, bones, and marrow are within you. So then you're relegated to the subjective, time-bound, earth-bound, geography-bound way of thinking about the world. So many flowers in your eyes, so much floating dust. Dust stands for what? For obstructions, confusion, delusion. You have not yet been liberated for countless eons. So notice that Kazon is now flipped to the other side of the coin. So one way of talking about it is we are always already fully awakened. There cannot be We cannot be outside of nirvana. Why? Because nirvana is not a specific place. It is not a specific time. It is not dependent on a specific set of conditions. Nirvana is the unconditioned, is beyond time, is beyond place. Therefore, it is accessible to us because it is everywhere, at all times, at all places. It is always present, right here, right now. That's one way of talking about it. The other part of it, however, thank goodness, is the part that says, you must realize that. You must have an embodied experience of that, because otherwise simply saying it doesn't have much value. Is actually kind of a Pollyanna form of practice. So that's the other side, that's the bottom of this paragraph. You have not yet been liberated for countless eons, and for eons to come you will be ruined. So he's not contradicting himself. He's simply talking about different perspectives on the same reality. This is what we need to understand as practitioners. From what perspective are we looking at the thing? So going to the top of page 34 in the Cook, if only once you thoroughly know the Lord, then Kasyapa will be able to move his toes in your sandals. So nice. So that the Lord is referring to Shakyamuni Buddha himself. And I just want to say this. So there's a note here, note number 12, on page 283 of the Cook. So Cook tells us that Lord, Shujinko, is a synonym for terms like Buddha nature, mind, essential nature, and so on in Zen. Although this term is often used by Keizan, it was never used by Dogen, to the best of my knowledge. Actually, I think it was. At least to my knowledge, Dogen was quoted as having shifted the teaching that we all have Buddha nature to we all are Buddha nature. I'm not exactly sure where that shows up in Shobogenzo. But in any event, what I wanted to point out is ultimately the Lord is no self. And I would say that's not correct. Non-self or no self is an attribute of what is meant here by when he uses the word the Lord, what is meant by Buddha nature or awakening, true nature, original nature, any of those things. It has that attribute of no self, but it is not synonymous with that. So this word, the Lord, means nibbana and samsara, nibbana and the absolute and the subjective in complete mutual expression. That's what it means. So if you don't know that, or once you know that, rather, at the top of page 34, then Kasyapa, who also represents that, right? Awakening, he will be able to move his toes in your sandals. Such a cute little metaphor. Then he says, don't you know that Gautama, that's the Buddha's name before he was called the Buddha, the awakened one. Gautama completely vanished when he raised his eyebrows and blinked. Right? In nirvana, there is no specificity of an individual. All characteristics and conditions have fallen away. And that Kasyapa was enlightened when he smiled. Isn't it our own then? That is Keizan's point right here. Isn't it our own? How could it be otherwise? So here, the Buddha held up a flower and showed that it was unchanging. And Kasyapa smiled to show that it was eternal. That all things are in the midst of nirvana. And this is important when we see this played out in various parts of Mahayana Buddhism. So early Buddhism, the three marks or characteristics of reality are said to be impermanence, dukkha, meaning unsatisfactoriness or suffering, and non-self. And later in the Mahayana, it becomes impermanence, non-self, and nirvana. All things exist within those three principles, or demonstrate those three principles. They have those characteristics. And at first it seems like a contradiction, actually. But again, if we understand nirvana as not something which is far off in time or in space, then it makes sense. And actually, if we look at, there's a sutta called the Roots Sutta in the Pali texts, in which the Buddha specifically says, all things culminate in, all things end in nirvana. But then he goes on and confuses you all by saying that Kasyapa has not entered nirvana even now. And what that means is that awakening is not extinguished. So just urgently practice the way today. Do not yearn for antiquity. This is what Keizan exhorts us to do. Mm-hmm. If you practice the way incessantly, going to the second paragraph on page 35, if you practice the way incessantly and master it in detail, then the Venerable Shakyamuni will instantly appear. It is only because you have not clarified the self, yourself, what this body and mind actually are, that Shakyamuni entered nirvana in ancient times, that you relate to it in that historical, geographical way. And then the poem, know that in a remote place in a cloud-covered valley, there is still a sacred pine that passes through the chill of ages. So even in the place of seclusion, even in the place of having stepped out of the world, so to speak, there is still the sacred pine. So Kasyapa is the sacred pine. And so are you. that passes through the chill of the ages. So chill is the extinguishment, the cooling. Mm. So no matter where you go, there is still awakening.